Hello, everyone. My name is Rishi Lohar, and I will be discussing what I worked on this semester, which are standard Young Tableaux. So I think the best way to start talking about this is just to start with the definition. So here's our definition for our partition. So a partition lambda of a positive integer n is just a weakly decreasing k tuple. So lambda is just k integers, essentially lambda 1, lambda 2, all the way to lambda k, such that when you add up all of the tuples, all of the elements of lambda, you get back the original integer n, where of course each lambda I is in the non-negative integers for all I. And then if we have such a k tuple, we say that it is an element of the partitions of n. And so intuitively, all a partition really is just a way that you can add up numbers less than n to get n. Probably the simplest one is just the number itself, right? That will be a partition because that's n plus however many zeros you want. So we would just write that as n, perhaps with parentheses around it. So let's just start with the example n equals 4. So this is pretty simple. We can just have lambda is equal to 4 itself. We could have lambda is equal to 2, 2. Lambda is equal to 3, 1. And lambda is equal to 1, 1, 1, 1. And in general, you could have, for instance, lambda, you could, yeah. And you can see that it actually, the order matters because we stipulated that it has to be a weakly decreasing sequence of integers. So that, for instance, if you had 3 plus 1, that will of course be equal to 1 plus 3. So really 3, 1 and 1, 3 are the same partition. But for the sake of simplicity, we just write them such that it's weakly decreasing. Another thing to note is that in general, if you have a large integer n, you could, for instance, have the partition mu is equal to 1, 1 with n ones. And that could be a bit of a handful to write down. So what we do is we adopt the notation that if we have a multiplicity within our partition, we'll write the number that is being repeated to the number of times that it's repeated. So 1 to the n. So this isn't exponentiation. This just denotes the number of times that we repeat 1 in this particular partition. So if we come back down here to this 1, 1, 1 case, we can just rewrite that as 1 to the 4. Okay. So that was pretty easy. So now we can move on to Young diagrams. So Young diagrams are just a visual way to represent partitions of natural numbers. So instead of writing them as tuples, k tuples, so this is a partition of 4, right? Because 3 plus 1 is 4. And this is a partition of 7. We can instead write them as left adjusted boxes so that the first row corresponds to the first input in our tuple, and so on and so forth. And so so the number of columns in each Young diagram will correspond to the maximum number in the tuple. So yeah, see here we have 4, 2, and then 1. And of course, if you add up all the boxes, you'll just get back the number of which you have a partition of. Okay, so now we're ready to talk about standard Young Tableau. So this is a bit of a mouthful, but we'll get through it. So a standard Young Tableau, or as we'll just abbreviate it, an SYT, of shape lambda in the partitions of n, so lambda is a partition of n, is an array aij of integers in the set of integers from 1 to n, obtained by filling each box in the Young diagram, which we label ij, so I for rows and j for columns, just like a matrix, with a number such that aij is less than aik and aij is less than alj for k greater than j and l greater than I. So all of this last part, that just means that if we look along our rows and columns, the numbers that we're inputting into the boxes are always increasing. And so it'll help to just look at some examples. So here we have some examples. So up here, we just took our previous Young diagram and we filled it with numbers from 1 to n, in this case 4, to get a standard Young tableau. And we can see that along the rows, we are increasing. And along the columns, we are also increasing in the downwards direction. And we say that this partition is of shape 3, 1. Similarly, we have our Young diagram from last time, and we've just filled it with integers so that we have a standard Young tableau. So yeah, we're increasing along our rows and increasing along our columns. But drawing all these boxes can get quite tedious. So in the future, we'll sort of just ignore the boxes and write the numbers in an array and just imagine that the boxes are still there. And so here you can see that we have a standard Young tableau of shape. So let's see, 5, 1, 1, 1. So remember, we can write this instead of with 3 1s, we can just write it as 1 to the 3. And here we just have a SYT of shape 2, 2. So 2 to the 2. And just in general, actually, any square shaped standard Young tableau will just look something like k to the k. Okay. So we'll use the terms partition and Young diagram interchangeably. So it's okay to think of either the set of boxes as a partition or just the tuple itself. In what we're going to be doing, I think thinking of them as boxes or more visually is actually more helpful. It's actually way more helpful. So I'd suggest thinking of them more as boxes rather than as lists of numbers. Okay, so now that we're familiar with what partitions and standard Young tableau are, we can start to talk about the interesting things that they can do and the properties that they have. And just before we get too far into it, this notation right here, this just, so if we write like SYT of lambda, that just means that for any given partition lambda, SYT of lambda is just the set of all standard Young tableau of lambda. So if we take the cardinality of that, we just call T lambda the number of SYT of shape lambda. Okay. So now what we're looking at here is something called the Robinson-Shenstedt correspondence. And this is a theorem. And so given any integer n in the set of positive integers, and if T lambda is equal to the number of SYT of shape lambda, where lambda is a partition of n, then if we sum over all partitions in the set of partitions of n, and we square the number of SYT of that shape and add them all up, we will always get n factorial. And this might seem kind of strange, like where did this come from? What does this mean? Well, we can kind of dissect both sides and kind of get an intuitive understanding of what this actually is. So yeah, so what does this mean? So essentially, so we know that the symmetric group, for instance, has n factorial elements, right? And so this is just a fact. But the right-hand or the left-hand side, this is telling us that this is the number of pairs of SYT of the same shape. And so we can think of it sort of like, so you have a partition, and the number of pairs you can make with it is just T lambda squared, the pairs of SYT, right? So if you add up T lambda squared for each lambda, you will just get the number of pairs of the same shape. So by definition. And this is actually proved through what's called sort of like a bijective proof with something called the Robinson-Shenstedt algorithm. And so the RSC, the Robinson-Shenstedt correspondence, gives a bijection between pairs of SYTs of the same shape, we call them P and Q, and permutations pi in the symmetric group of degree n. And this bijection comes from the Robinson-Shenstedt algorithm. So here's our example. So we start with this partial tableau. And a partial tableau is just a Young diagram filled with some integers between 1 and n, but perhaps not all of them. So here we can see that we're missing the number 3, and it goes up to 9. And so we can imagine this as being a Young diagram with 8 cells, or a Young diagram with 9 cells, but missing a number. Either way, it doesn't really matter. That's why it's kind of nice to write them just as numbers floating in space rather than boxes. You can always add more boxes as you need to. Okay, so what's our goal? Our goal here is to we want to somehow row insert the number 3 into this array here. And so the simplest way to do that would be, well, just to tack it on to the very first row, but clearly that doesn't work. And you can see that you can't add 3 into this array without moving something. And so the algorithm goes a bit as follows. So if you're adding a new element into your partial array, you first start with your first row, and you ask yourself, okay, is the number that we're inserting, 3, less than some element of the first row? And if that answer is yes, then you find the smallest element that's bigger than it. And in this case, it's 5. All right. So we then place 3 where 5 is, and then we bump 5 out. Okay, simple enough. So we can see that here. So we insert 3 into the tableau, and then we bump 5 out. And then we repeat the same process with the next number, the number that was bumped out. So now we move down the next row, and we try to row insert 5 into the second row. And we ask ourselves the same question, is 5 less than some element of the second row? And it is. It's less than 7. And we want to now find the smallest element that is larger than 5, and the only element that's larger than 5 is 7. So 7 is the smallest element. And so now we can bump 7 out. And we can continue this if we look over here. So now we've added 5 in and we've bumped 7 out. Okay, so now we ask ourselves the question again, is 7 less than some element of the third row? No, it's not. And this is actually the easy case. In this case, we can just tack 7, or we can just append 7 directly to this row, right? It's going to be greater than 6, so it's increasing along that row, the tableau would be. And it's also increasing along the column, right? Because 2, 5, 7 is an increasing sequence. And so now we've managed to add the number 3, or row insert, as it's called, the number 3 into the partial tableau, P, that we had above. Okay. And it turns out that this is actually a reversible algorithm. So you can actually run this backwards to find which number bumped a given number into the tableau. So you could start with, say, you want to take out 7 and you want to find out which element you had to row insert to get 7 to where it currently is in this position. And you can run this in reverse, called the reverse Robinson-Shenstedt algorithm. And you'll find that that number is 3. 3 will pop out at the end. And in general, you could start with just like the empty set and some string of numbers, maybe pi, x1, x2, xn, some sequence in the symmetric group of degree n. And you can take each element, x1, x2, xn, run it through the RS algorithm and construct a pair of standard Young tableau of the same shape with the RS algorithm. So we write it sort of like this. So RS of pi, where pi is some permutation in Sn, is equal to some pair PQ of SYT of the same shape. And so we'll write this sort of, we'll just write this as SYT lambda cross SYT lambda, because that's what it is. Okay. So the question then becomes, how do we find the T lambda, the number of SYT of shape lambda? And that is answered by the hook length formula. So the hook length formula gives us T lambda, and it is n factorial divided by this product here, where ij in lambda just denotes the cells of our partition, and the h sub l of ij is something called the hook length of the ijth cell in lambda. Okay, but now we have this other term that we don't know. What is the hook length? Well, I'm glad you asked. We can do this fairly simply, just visually. So say we just have some partition. What are the hook lengths of each cell? Well, the hook lengths, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's just the length of the hook. So for example, if you're looking at the hook length HL11, in this case, that's just going to be, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's the number to the right, the number below it, and the cell itself. Yeah, that's the hook length for this one. And we can fill this out if we so choose. So we have, So we have 6, and then 4, 2, 1, 3, 1, 1. And this is also called a tableau. It's just not a standard Young tableau. A tableau is just really, you're just filling out these boxes with integers. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about the work that I did specifically. And so with the standard Young tableau, I was sort of interested in the structures that they form rather than their combinatorial properties. And so I attempted to go through and sort of define sort of hierarchy or a structure to different standard Young tableau. And so this is one of these structures essentially. So this is the notion of a subtableau. And I guess before we go through the definition, we can sort of think about it intuitively. So really all it is just a standard Young tableau inside of another standard Young tableau. So you can imagine just having an array of integers and chopping off some of the higher terms. And then what you're left with is just another standard, another standard Young tableau. But more rigorously, we can make a definition, and it goes as follows. So let lambda be a partition of n, and let T lambda be an standard Young tableau of shape lambda. So we say that T mu is a subtableau of T lambda if 3 conditions are met. So mu has to be a partition of k for some k less than or equal to n. Mu I has to be less than lambda I for all I. So all of the terms in the k tuple, or I guess whatever tuple mu is, have to be less than all of the elements in lambda I, or in lambda. And T mu itself has to be in the set of standard Young tableau of shape mu, because it has to be a standard Young tableau. Okay, and just some notation for saying if one standard Young tableau is a proper subset of another, or a proper subtableau of another, or not. It's this curly less than or equal to sign. I'm not actually sure what it's called, but we put the underbar sort of like less than or equal to, or if it is not necessarily a proper subtableau, or we ignore that this underline. We ignore this. We get rid of it if it is a proper subtableau of T lambda. Okay, and just for an example, so we see here. So we have T lambda is equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, essentially. So the 2, 2, 1 partition of shape 2, 2, 1. And we have T mu, which is of shape 2, 1. And you can see, sort of as I was saying, that this part here is properly contained inside of our standard Young tableau here. So that's really all of this subtableau stuff means, is that you can, if you match up the ones of one subtableau with another, and it fits perfectly inside of it without sticking out, and the numbers all match up, then it's a subtableau. Okay. And as a consequence, we just have a theorem. So if we have some partition lambda and some standard Young tableau of shape lambda, then T lambda has exactly n non-empty standard subtableau. So let's just go through the outline of the proof here, because I can't go through every single detail, but we'll just start with the important parts. So first thing that we want to look at or acknowledge is that the Robinson-Shenstedt algorithm guarantees that there's some permutation in Sn such that when you apply the RS algorithm to it, you get a pair of standard Young tableau. So of the same shape. So we can call that pair P and our T lambda, same. And P really can just be any arbitrary standard Young tableau of shape lambda. Okay. But in addition to just this permutation in Sn, we actually have an entire sequence of tableau, or pairs of tableau. They're not pairs of standard Young tableau, because each of these P's is actually a partial tableau until we get to the very last one. As we saw in our example for the Robinson-Shenstedt algorithm, we didn't have a full-fledged standard Young tableau until we had completed inserting all of the numbers into the array. However, on the right here, these at each step of the RS algorithm are standard Young tableau. And that's because these are called the recording tableau. And those are formed just by matching the elements in the last inserted element into PK, for instance. You place K at the position where you last placed an element in PK. And so at each step, you're actually adding them in the order that they were being added. And so you at each step, you have a standard Young tableau. And so, in fact, that gives us that each of these Qi is a standard subtableau of the the T lambda. And so we get this nice chain here of standard subtableau, proper standard subtableau, starting with the empty set and going all the way up to our original standard Young tableau. So we can just show that if, say, T mu is a proper subtableau of T lambda, then it must appear in that list from Q1 to Qn, because we're not including the empty set as a standard Young tableau. We can show that if a standard of an FSYT is a subtableau of T lambda, that it must appear in the sequence of Qs. So from that, we can then conclude that there are going to be exactly n of them. And in addition to there being or exactly n standard sub-tableau for any given tableau, it turns out that this chain of tableau, these queues that we get here, are unique to every standard sub or every standard young tableau. So with each step, we've been moving to slightly more and more abstract concepts concerning standard young tableau. And the next one is slightly more abstract, but certainly not too much. So we're going to talk about the young lattice, which is a partially ordered set. I've denoted it YL, and it has the relation less than or equal to. And it's just the set of all lambda in the partitions of n, such that n is a non-negative integer. So you can think of it as just the collection of all of the partitions. So all the young diagrams essentially live in the young lattice. And since it's a partially ordered set, you can turn it into, or you can visualize it in something called a Haas diagram. So here we have the Haas diagram for the young lattice. So all the Haas diagram really is it is sort of like a graph where the vertices denote partitions or partitions or young diagrams, and edges denote covering relations. So this is oriented in a descending manner. So as you go lower, you get larger partitions. So you could sort of imagine drawing, this symbol. So 1, 1 is, it covers the partition 1, 1, 1, 1 covers the partition 1, 1, and so on and so forth. Okay. So a question that I had when I was exploring this is, kind of wanted to figure out how to characterize like the structure here. And a question I had is there a general way to characterize the number of paths one could take, say, from here back to the empty set? And it turns out that is something that can be characterized. And we do that with something called the path number. Okay, so the path number. Well, so we can so before we go and look at a definition, we'll try to think of it intuitively. So let's see, so here, let's say we start here. So this would be the partition 1, 1, 1, or just 1 to the 3, based on our other notation. And clearly, there's really only one way to get back to the empty partition. There's no other path that you could take. So we can think maybe like, why would this be? Well, we could think of the different ways you could construct such a partition. Really, the only way you can do it is just by adding another 1 over and over again, right? So, and similarly, this is same with the transposes, really, right? So this is just the transpose 3, and it also only has 1 path back. But there doesn't really seem to be a universal pattern that emerges. And as you go to higher and higher terms, this young lattice actually becomes quite complicated. I think when you get to, let's see, if you get to like n equals 169, there are about 10 to the 180 different paths one could take from some standard young tableau back to this empty set. So the number of paths is enormous. 169 is a pretty big number, but I think, yeah, once you get to 5 or 6, I think it already goes to about 42. So it grows quite quickly. But we can still figure some stuff out with that. So now let's just take a look at the definition of the path number. Okay. So if we let lambda be some partition of n, the path number of lambda, which we'll denote as paths lambda, denotes the number of distinct sets, so mu I from I equals 0 to n, in YL, so as subsets of the Young lattice, such that they form this chain. And I make this note here like with no gaps. That just means that there are no other partitions that fit between two elements of the mu I here. So it's all filled in essentially. So we can go back up here and look maybe for an example. So if we just choose some element of the Young lattice here, say this one's kind of interesting. This one here, we want all sets that form a chain that go to 0 with no gaps between them. Well, one could include this partition, this partition, this partition, or this partition, maybe different colors, or this partition, this partition, this partition, or some combination of the two. So we could then perhaps do this partition, and this partition. So those are all each of those sequences of colors are all different sets that satisfy this definition. And we can see that it matches up with our idea, the intuitive idea of path. If you imagine walking from green over here while staying on red, on these red paths, and making your way back to the empty set. Okay, so let's talk about some of the properties of the path number. Okay, so this is a different set mu I, but if we have some set mu I of subsets of the partitions of n-1, for instance, and it's the set of all direct predecessors, which just means that it is the collection of all partitions in the Young lattice that cover n, or that lambda covers, but there's nothing between them. So for instance, we can take a look back up here. So like the direct predecessors of, say, we can go back to the, so the direct predecessors of 2, 1, 1, that would just be 1, 1, 1, and 2, 1. Those would be the direct predecessors. And this property here tells us that if we have the set of direct predecessors, then the paths of lambda will be equal to the sum of the paths of all of the direct predecessors. And this also, again, makes sense because, so for instance, we can look here, we see that for 2, 1, 1, there's one, we'll draw it out again, 1, 2, oops. So we see for 2, 1, 1, there is one path, two paths, and 3 paths that you can go back down in the direct predecessors. So this one has one path, and 2, 1 has one path and 2 paths. And so we can see that, okay, 2 plus 1 does indeed equal 3, and that is the number of paths that 2, 1, 1 has. Okay, another property that's kind of nice is that for any partition in the Young lattice, the paths of the partition are equal to the paths of its transpose, which is fairly intuitive. You wouldn't expect much to change of the structure of a partition just based on taking its transpose. Okay, and to finish up today, we'll just look at one final theorem, and that's that the path number for any partition in the Young lattice is actually identically equal to the number of SYT, or the number of standard Young tableau of shape lambda. And yeah, okay. So before we get started on the outline, we're just going to introduce a little bit of more new notation just to make things a bit easier. So P of square brackets lambda denotes the set of paths as defined in the path number. So if we go back up to the definition, we have these collections of sets here, these guys right here. So each of those is a path, essentially. And so the set of all of those is the paths of lambda. So we can come back up here. The set of paths, say for this guy here, that's just going to be this set, oops. That's just going to be the set containing these three guys here, because there's only one path. And so it only contains one element. It's just this set here. Right, so outline. So basically what we're doing is we're creating a bijection between the collection of paths, so P of square brackets lambda, and the SYT of lambda, the sets of all the standard Young tableau of shape lambda. That's what we're trying to do. And so the easiest way I thought of doing that was to just create two injections, one from the set of paths of lambda to the set of SYT of shape lambda, and one from the set of SYT of shape lambda to paths lambda, and then use the sort of Bernstein theorem to conclude that they have to be there has to exist a bijection, and so that the cardinality of the two sets is equal. Okay, so how do we first create, say, F from P of lambda to SYT of lambda? So let's start with this one. So for F, so we can just consider some path. And here I've written it out as a chain. So you can think of, like in the Haas diagram, we start at some lambda and then we go towards the empty set in some particular, choosing some particular partitions along the way while not skipping any. And this is just some particular path that we chose. It's arbitrary. And you can see here I have mu k minus 1 and mu k, some partitions in the path. And we want to somehow construct a standard Young tableau out of this chain. And it turns out you can do that by inserting numbers from 1 to n by taking the differences, basically, between two adjacent partitions in this chain here. So you can take, so if you take, say, mu k, so this one here, and subtract mu k minus 1, then you'll end up with one cell, and that's this blue guy here, because as you go up in the lattice, you're only increasing your number of cells by 1 each time. So the difference between two neighboring ones in this chain here, it has to be 1. So it'll be 1 cell. And so for each k, starting at n, so that would be up here, because lambda is a partition of n, you take the subtraction, you take that 1 cell, and you place k in that cell. And this results in a unique standard Young tableau. And so, like for instance, if you started with a different chain, the mu k minus 1 and mu k would differ at least somewhere in one or more places. So for instance, instead of perhaps having a blue square here, in some other chain, there would be maybe a green one here, and k would be added here instead of at the blue one, which is clearly going to yield a different standard Young tableau. And so that function, if we define f as going through this algorithm where we then generate this new standard Young tableau, that is a one-to-one function, so it's an injection. And then for G, we do something similar. It's basically the reverse, actually, of it. So what you do is you take any standard Young tableau, and then you remove each element from it in descending order. So you start at n and then n minus 1, and you remove each of them one at a time while keeping track of the shapes of the resultant tableau each time. So it's like you're taking a cell away each time you take away a number. And so those resulting cells, those collections, those partitions, really the shape of the resulting tableau, are those will form your chain. And that actually forms a unique chain. And again, that's because if you have two different standard Young tableau, they will differ at least two places because you have to interchange the locations of two numbers inside of the tableau. Then that means that the path will then have to, the path that you generate, that chain of partitions, will then have to differ at least two places as well. And so this is also an injection. And so just from the Schroeder-Bernstein theorem, you can conclude then that this theorem indeed has to be true. Anyways, yeah, thank you so much. I enjoyed this project, enjoyed working this semester with Professor Davis, and thank you all for listening.